So we've had a number of interesting questions or interesting perspectives from our speakers. And just for those of you who may not have seen messages in chat, we're going to run the session on a few minutes longer to 3:30 local time. So we'll just shorten the next break. I was hoping at the moment I'd ask if all of the presenters could sort of turn on the cameras and mics, so we just sort of have a quick sort of discussion, few questions that were raised. One of them that I wanted to look at was the question of the factors in gaming. Jim has sort of told us that we shouldn't actually color things in at all because that itself is a problem. So very real world examples of how coalition leadership worked or didn't work in the field, and how some of these variables are actually critical to seeing how things work. David touched upon some historical coalitions and their behavior, but also looked at some factors you may want to build into a game. So we've covered a whole load of bases there. But one question I wanted to come back to that came from Vish was we're talking about sort of the issue of sort of human factors and the performance of different organizations. But does anybody have any sort of suggestions for the actual mechanisms to try and capture that inside a game? I'll throw that open to anybody who wants to say anything to say.
Well, I think one of the easiest ones was demonstrated by Jim in one of his games to do with language. And that was your percentage of accuracy with your interpreter. And that was done very simply by printing out what you wanted to say. And then if your interpreter's 60% accurate, you cross out 40% of the words, very simply. That's one that I'll offer.
There was one that Tom was very much involved in which actually reflected. We were doing a game about interactions in a village context, and Tom was the interpreter, and his job, we didn't allow, it was a UN intervention, we didn't allow the UN players to talk to the villagers, only Tom could talk to the villagers, and so they had to rely on Tom going backwards and forwards with his thoroughly reliable translation of what he'd been told in the other room. Now that's a bit of theatre, but I think there are mechanisms for misinformation and misunderstanding which are relatively straightforward. I mean, there's also things like communication delay, which you can build into your game system. It's actually really a powerful tool to say one side or one participant has sent a message. You then hold that message for a turn and deliver it a turn late. And most people don't always grasp that there might have been a delay, and they read it out of context. You can get all sorts of interesting challenges. I think the issue with reflecting that difference of language and different perspective is a tricky one, because you do also run the risk of skewing the problem. And so if the game is all about interesting ways of messing up players' communication, that's one thing, but it has to be to a purpose. And so it's something that has to come into your design very early on. You have to be very clear at the beginning what friction factors you're going to apply. Over.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those observations. The miss every fifth word or miss every seventh word or whatever is being used also to represent EW and jamming in garbled communications and so on and so forth. It's an old trick. But I think to answer Vish's question, I think that if you're trying to think about the human element of it, the most obvious thing is to have the real people or have the real nationalities in the room, playing their nationalities. I don't believe in the role-playing side of it. I think that's too difficult. I think, we're all sort of, white, military types trying to role-play a coalition member who isn't of that type. I think is quite tricky. You end up in a Dungeons and Dragons type situation. But I think you can, harder things like morale, harder things like logistics, harder things like, communication issues are very easily represented in the game at an abstract level. It's the effect that you're after rather than the detail of it, perhaps, unless it's an education game.
I reinforce that what David's saying, particularly logistics and CSS. The number of times those aspects have been ignored or hand waved away, really to the detriment of the study, because it's, quote, too hard. It's not too hard. It's just not that the effort has not been put in. And you know, I mean, I don't want to be critical of people. Actually, I do. It's lazy game design, and it should be avoided at all costs.
I'd like to point out something from the other side. I mean, Wayne mentioned that with NATO war games, people are very anxious to avoid upsetting the opposition, so they deal with fantasy scenarios. Although of late they've been less fantasy than they have been in the past. So the enemy always started with the letter R recently, which is quite useful because then you can remember who the enemy is. But I was involved in a game where it was a simulation, computer simulation, where we were rather worried that one nation wouldn't appear to be performing very well. So I was invited by the 3-star general to make sure that they did well. So I had to label their Leopard 1 tanks as Leopard 1 with improved fire control system, and then hide a Leopard 2 underneath it. So every time they went to fight, it was a Leopard 2, really, but so that they wouldn't be embarrassed by their capabilities. So yeah, there's, you know, what are we doing the game for? Have we got a coalition as part of the game? Are we really going to help things by embarrassing our allies? Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting point, Tom, because I think that then draws us into a place where there are two classes of games for whatever purpose. In one class, we have a coalition which is coming together to game, and you don't want to embarrass your friends, and you don't want to reveal what you think they're really going to do or not do. The other sort of game is when you, working on your own, in your own headquarters, your own nation, where it might be, all for your own purpose to study something, and you may not want to share that game with those friends, regardless of what you'll be doing them. But that, in that case, presumably your design freedom is much broader.
I would add to that, Ben. I mean, I'm often called upon to create games for all sorts of organizations. So one of the questions I ask them is are you really interested in team building, or are you interested in learning something? And those two things can be the same, but they also can be quite different. And so if you like the team building game, you don't really want to embarrass everyone on the team. You want everyone to come out of it positive, hugs and warm feeling. If you want to learn, I have to say, I think learning comes from pain, crisis, and failure. And if you're not exposing people to pain, crisis, and failure, what are you doing? But that again, world according to Jim.
No, well, thank you.
And can I add one fast one there, Ben, really quick? I think you can also make some factors or situations anonymous. You know, Tony earlier on in the day mentioned the work that we did with CF Incom in terms of the organizational design. It was a game. It wasn't a war game. It was a you know, a project to a certain extent, an analysis project. But you know, we had, you know, commentary from people within the organization as to just how bad things were in certain areas and how good things were as well. But we made that commentary anonymous, but we still used the input in the game to actually get, to quote Jim, you know, pain at the right point to get people to take notice. So I think you can anonymize certain things. You can say, you know, what happens if the logistics of unit X were absolutely appalling, and you know, randomize it perhaps to a certain extent. You say, you know, how would you deal with that as a problem? Because, and then you're not pointing the finger at the Italians or the Dutch or whoever you decide to pick on that day. By the way, the quote "typical" came from my platoon sergeant way back when the Dutch didn't turn up for 2 fucking days, and he said "typical." Sorry, that's where that quote came from.
So I think we'll be run towards the end of time on this. Apologies for the slight overrun, but I hope everybody's sort of happy that we had an interesting sort of discussion and follow on there. If I can try to summarize it, is that So the question was, how do we wargame beyond generic blue? The first thing we do is we get rid of blue and all other colors and make them something else. We've also learned some key factors we need to build in. Tom has told us that there are very real differences that make things, people behave differently, and it makes a real difference, and individuals behave differently and they make a difference too. So we've got to get those into the game. And David, in his slides, there were a number of factors, technical factors we can build into a game design: interoperability, commonality of equipment, representing the logistics, the trust and friction between moving things between different people, the missed pieces of information. So hopefully between us, we've generated some real insights into how to build a game of a coalition, and also insights into how to build it and some of the factors we want to build in. And so hopefully in the future, we will not see hex maps with grids with all the colors painted in that nice sort of NATO blue color and the other former Warpack red color moving across their hexes in their large stacks, smashing into each other, and we can do better. So thank you, gentlemen, all of you, and for contributions. I think that was a great panel exercise. Rex, back to you.
Yes, and I'd like to thank you all too. It was a terrific panel, lots of interesting discussion, and who'd have thought that a coalition of panel presenters and people trying to find the slides would run 15 minutes over. So I think we made our point there very nicely. So we will now have a 15 instead of 30-minute break. We had planned a breakout room on coalition warfare, but we've ended up talking about coalition warfare for 15 minutes longer, so we won't have it. So we'll just be starting again in 15 minutes.